and a very good evening to all of you. Thank you so much for being part of today's crossword session. And I'm sure it's going to be a wonderful, wonderful one. Especially, I know it's Friday and everybody has some plans, though we are still in the midst of a pandemic. But I can vouch that this is going to be a beautiful experience because we have the prolific, inimitable, and wonderful writer, critic, translator, Shanta Gokhale with us today. Shanta Gokhale has recently released a book called Shyamchi Ai, if you can see it here. It's a translation of a book which was originally written by Sani Guruji nearly 85 years ago. And it's one of the most beautifully written classics in Marathi literature. Has had so many number of editions, sold lakhs of copies. But what is interesting actually is that it never really had a great English translation, which also means that this book has been inaccessible for a large number of non Marathi speaking English reading readers. And what Shanta Gokhale ji has done is phenomenal because by translating a book like this one, she has suddenly opened many doors to different kinds and beautiful stories that we are going to be talking about. So, can we please have Shanta Gokhale ji on screen? Hello, ma'am. Good evening.
Hi. Hi.
It's always such a pleasure to speak with you, especially in the last few years that I have had the privilege of connecting with you on different occasions, and your work ethic and everything about you is just splendid, and I have deep admiration for it. So I'm very excited to be part of this session today and speaking about a book that I have just come to love, and for the first time read it. And must I add how much it has touched me to the point that when I last read this book sometime last week, I remember having this. I remember being consumed by this feeling of overwhelming sadness by the end of it, without giving away too much. There were mixed feelings of pain, anger, and it felt like Shyam's mother, Shyamchi Ai, was my own mother. And I had a feeling of helplessness by the end of it when I kept the book. In the translator's note in the book, you write of a similar impact that the book had on you when you read it as a child. Um, could you tell us what was it like, and what were the feelings that you were experiencing when you first read the book?
Very similar to yours, except I constantly felt the difference, the huge valley that separated Sham's eye from my eye, because ultimately I was born into privilege. And I just felt, look, I'm being sent to a good school. I don't have to work for this. Everything is arriving before me at my door. And I'm taking all these things for granted. Of course, it should be like this. Of course, it should be like that. And then I read this book, and it isn't. It isn't like that at all. Every little bit of food has been shared, and yet you get a small portion, but you are so happy. It would make me feel a little guilty also, because not that I must say this for myself, I wasn't much of a complainer, but there were occasions on which I felt, oh, this isn't as it should be. Not so tasty, no salt. There's a chapter in Shamji Ai where the mother forgets to add salt and everybody just eats the food as if it had everything in it. And she's terribly upset afterwards. And it's a story that really touched me very deeply. And there are a whole lot of others where I'm a big weeper. So, I kept weeping all the time, wiping my eyes, reading again, then weeping again. So, at the end of it, yes, you do kind of feel helpless. I think you put it absolutely correctly. Helplessness. How and what is it? Why is it like this? Why does it have to be like this? Why can't all children have what I have? I felt that extremely deeply. So, those I'm recalling these things. I mean, look, it's 70 years ago. So, for me, it's a long journey back to remember.
Was telling me that the book, Sani Guruji's book, Shamchi Ai, is almost like a rite of passage for any member of a Marathi household. Everyone reads this book. Um, what is, if you could throw some light on the book that Sani Guruji wrote, and what kind of impact has it had on Marathi literature?
See, um, it's very difficult for an individual to judge what impact a book has on people because it's not as if over the last 50 years it has been written about. I, there's no talk about it, there's no discussion. It is just one of those things that are simply taken for granted as part of your literary culture. And it is so taken for granted that a question like yours um, befuddles me to some. I really, honestly don't. I can't make a statement about the impact that it has had. I only have um, the kind of evidence that one puts together, like this particular edition from which I translated. The publisher bought the rights, I think, in 2011. And by 2018, there were already 18 editions of this book. So that's an edition per year. Now, that speaks of impact. The other evidence is Jnanpith Award winner Bhalchandra Nemade put up a list of 10 books which are a must read for all Marathi reading people. And Shamchi Ai was one of them. So it does get included into all the classics that we have. And obviously, it is still being read. And you can go anywhere in Maharashtra and say, Shamchi Ai. You don't have to say anything further. People know, people remember, they will tell you their favorite stories. So, obviously, the impact is huge. I have come to know of it only now when questions like yours come up and I have to think very deeply. Now, how do I know it has had this kind of impact? So these are the facts really that tell us that it has. Yeah?
favorite story, ma'am? Which is your favorite story in the book?
Um, there are so many, but um, I'm totally charmed by the story about how Shams I insists that he must make his own leaf plate if he wants to have lunch and dinner. He has been shirking this duty. Sham is a difficult child, as he himself knows and admits throughout. I think that is what makes this such a charming book because he's like everyone else. His mother is different, she is unique. And of course, his focus is his mother. But he's very self denigrating and obviously he's been shirking this and he doesn't like to be told to do certain things, and everyone is trying very hard to make sure that he gets his lunch, and then he submits to this pain of having to tack leaves together to make himself a plate for lunch. And he does it very shabbily, doesn't concentrate. So the little tag goes into his throat. And then so the mother says, look, is this what we want to do to visitors who come and have lunch and dinner with us? You can't do it this way. Anything that you make has to be perfect. You have to concentrate entirely on the job in hand and turn out the best that you can. After which, he makes such a beautiful leaf plate that his father can't believe that he has made it. So, for me, I, while I was reading this story, I kept hearing my parents because this is one of the lessons that all of us are taught. Do something, do it as perfectly as you can. So it's a story that's very close to my heart. And the other one I often talk about this is the story about his swimming. He doesn't want to learn swimming. He's scared stiff of the water. His mother said, nothing doing. I don't want the people of this village to call my children scaredy cats. So you better learn. And all your friends know, including the girls. So she drives him out of the house rather brutally, beating him all the way with a stick while he's howling away, don't. But she won't let go. Finally, he is at the well, and little by little, he does finally learn to swim. I related very deeply to this story because I was very scared of water. I, our father took us on a special month-long holiday to teach us swimming. So we would visit the swimming pool every day. And every day I went through the same exercise. 1, 2, 3, no jumping in. 1, 2, 3, no jumping in. And yeah, finally, there was this friend of my father's who was watching all this. And he didn't have my father's patience. He picked me up and threw me in. And I came up spluttering with water in my nose and eyes, but I learned to swim. Not too well, but I learned to swim. I hated that man. I hated him. I never ever again spoke to that friend of my father's. who had dunked me into the pool. But yes, so when I was reading that story back then and now, even when I was translating, I was saying, there, Sham, I know how it feels. I know exactly what's going through your heart. It's going thump, thump, thump. So those two stories, and of course, a whole lot of others. But those are two things that really are very close to me.
Shyam's mother, she epitomizes these values of wisdom, hard work, honesty, kindness. She is, in a way, like most of our mothers, our parents, the values that she's teaching her children. These are simple things that we learn at home. At least most of us do. Um, Yet, when one sees this through a feminist lens, there are things that we question, and maybe considering this book was obviously written at a different time in our history, when women have had a different role in the society. You see this push and pull that is constantly happening. Sham's mother is someone who knows her place. She stands up for herself. At the same time, she's very often has to is forced to help hold herself back, like when her father comes to speak to her husband, and she knows that the father is right, but she cannot challenge him because she has a husband to protect. And she even tells him, I love you and I love my husband. I love both of you, but I have to take a side. um, what do you have to, now that after you read it as a child and now when you were translating it, how did you see this person, this mother figure that is such a strong force in this book?
Yeah. Um, See, one always has to see these things historically in their own time. And I, uh, I have lived with two grandmothers, and both of them, while accepting the social rules that confined them in many ways, one of them was like meek and mild and wouldn't say a word to anybody. But the other one, she stood up for herself. She said what was on her mind. Point is, how far can you go? And of course, women couldn't go as far as they would have liked to. I think that Sham's mother is trapped between what she would like to do and what she can do. And the times weren't like ours, where some women can today challenge the system, but it leads to conflict. Conflict leads sometimes to splitting. And look at the word we use. We've split. Sounds like a piece of wood. So, and when people say we've split, they say it with that ease because obviously there are alternatives for them. There are other ways of living. There wasn't any other way of living for Shamsai. And once you've seen that as a reality, then what puts heart into you is that she is not like my other grandmother, the meek one. She is like the strong one. She'll go as far as she can go and only then withdraw. But having gone that far, I think that she makes a difference. Perhaps not to her husband, but certainly to her children. They are watching this, and they are the future generation. And they realize that this is what women have to go through. So, Sane Guruji, when he writes about how Sham was affected, there is an aside in one story where he says, look at our terrible culture. A school should be like a second home for children where they are loved and cared for, because that is how they learn. Instead of which, they're beaten black and blue. That is what used to happen back then. And then he says, look at the daughters in law in our society. A daughter in law leaves her home and goes to another. And there, really, they should look after her as they would look after their daughter. Instead of which, she is tormented, tortured, not given enough to eat, which is why, he says, we have a word, sasurvas, which means this torture by your in laws. There's a special word, no other. I found it very difficult to translate that word into English because other languages don't necessarily have that word because their culture is not our culture. So you have to see the woman in this total kind of context, and you realize then that this woman is actually pointing to the future. And that future has happened bit by bit. We are still not where we want to be, but we are getting there slowly, gradually. So I have no problems with Sham's mother.
She's a loving, she's such a gentle and beautiful soul, and this relationship that Shyam and his mother have is so angelic, almost it's just divine, of another kind. It's like a relationship between God and a devotee.
Yeah.
That's what I felt. That was my takeaway from the book. uh, Here I wanted to ask, there has been this very, what I've been noticing, a renewed interest in mother child relationships. And um, Avni Doshi's book, Burnt Sugar, which was released as Girl in White Cotton and was shortlisted for the Booker, was about a complex relationship between a mother and daughter. Renuka Shani, your daughter's movie that released recently, Tribhang, was again about a very complicated relationship. This book is different in a way that, though there are moments where Sham has this disagreements with his mother and is angry and feels upset, he's still very much completely bound by this love. It almost engulfs him to the point that it makes him a better human being. What I wanted to ask is, what makes this mother-child relationship so, um, for want of a better word, significant in literature, for it to be explored time and again in different ways? Say back then, 85 years ago, and even now, we're constantly trying to talk about this relationship because, in a way, I feel that it does have repercussions and consequences when it comes to the lives that we eventually go on to live, the mother and the child. So, if you could, share your thoughts on this.
Well, they aren't very different from your thoughts. I just want to pick up on the word devotee for a moment. Um, for me, especially in today's environment, devotee is a word that has become questionable because what it means is looking upon someone without ever questioning that person. Now, this is not what Sham does. I'll remind you of that story where there's this Durva Aji staying at their place. And she's one of those people who is obliging uh, by nature. People call her to help out, and she'll always go. But she is reneging on her commitment to Sham's mother at one point. And so they get into the kind of a wrangle, verbal wrangle, and both say things to each other about each other. And at the end of the story, Shamsai feels, regrets what she has said, apologizes. Then the older woman forgives her, etc. At the end of the story, Sham says that there are occasions when people cannot take the stress of living, and then this sort of thing happens. He says very clearly both women were at fault. So, just that one story tells me that when his mother errs, he sees it and he points it out. So, he's not that kind of a total devotee, unquestioning. That's one point. About the mother child relationship, it is something that was for the longest time taken for granted, that a mother loves her child, a child loves his or her mother. It is only in the modern age where phrases like generation gap were born. Otherwise, life was smooth. The parents passed on their way of life to children. Children passed that on to their children, and so on. Modernity has brought a break. And today's mother is also not the submissive woman of the old days. So she isn't trying her best to be the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the virtuous one. She is also giving way to who she is. And so you have two women, a mother and a daughter, both wanting to be themselves. And in being themselves, obviously, there are conflicts. And what makes a relationship so complex is the fact that the bond still remains, the bond of love between the child and mother is eternal, it's enduring, which is why the conflicts between them become painful. And where there is pain, artists will jump in. They will write pain, they will paint pain, they will sing pain. So it's natural that time has come when we talk about the complex relationship as it has become in the modern age compared to the earlier relationships that they had.
I hadn't known until I read the book and the translator's note, which is yours in the book, where you mentioned that when you were about 12 or 13, you attempted writing a book, which was in a way about your mother. And here I wanted to know, did you?
No, no, no,
Okay,
no. Sorry. I
yeah,
think, have I made a mistake in what I've written?
you did say
No,
something, and yeah, yeah, yeah.
Something of the kind. No,
Yes,
I think what I have said is that uh, because of reading Shamji, much later, I thought my mother is some amazing woman and
yes,
I really should write about her. And I've written so much in my life. And why am I not writing about her?
okay,
So, yeah, so that dream still exists. I still haven't written about her. I've made 2 or 3 starts, but I can't find a form. I began as a kind of diary of her life. Then I tried something else. I'm still trying. It'll happen. I want to write about her. She was quite an amazing person. And she's been as strong an influence on me as Shams I was on him.
let us digress a little here to discuss Sani Guruji, the writer of this text. He wrote the text when he was in prison,
Yeah.
and there is a mention of what he used a style called it is autobiographical. So he is in a way talking about his own life. He lived in Palghar in a village. Uh, the text uses something called a cover story to if you could talk about that and
Yeah.
what was the whole yeah.
Yes. See, a writer who wants to fictionalize his life, which is what Sane Guruji wanted to do. He says very pointedly, don't look upon this as my life. My life is something apart. Here it is just stories of my mother. Now, you want to extract those stories from the total context, which means that you are fictionalizing. Now, when you fictionalize, you have to find a form in which you can write those stories and a form that will give you a distance from the reality. This is fiction. So I have to stand back from it so that I'm able to look at it more objectively and to give it the form in which readers will find it interesting. Typically, when people begin to write about their lives, it becomes a very self obsessed kind of narrative. It's I, me, myself throughout. People may be interested, people may not be interested. Now, that's not a risk that he would have wanted to run in writing about his mother. So, probably all these thoughts came together. And he actually replicated the situation in which he was writing these stories and also narrating them. This is the prison situation. And the people to whom he was narrating the stories were the inmates of the prison. So he replicates this situation as an ashram where he and a bunch of people are living and working. He is somehow the senior most, the others seem to be younger than him. And then he creates this situation through his cover story. The cover story being that the other residents of the ashram say to him, look, we are constantly talking about ourselves and our lives, and you're always mum. You never tell us about your life. And then he says, no, no, that would, I wouldn't be. Uh, Typically, he is, of course, again, denigrating himself. I don't want to relive those bad things that I have been through. So that's his excuse. Ultimately, he makes this offer. I won't talk about myself. I'll tell you stories about my mother. And I will tell you one story per night. So that becomes the form of Shamchi Ai. That and the cover story continues throughout because very often in many of the stories, before the story itself begins, there is a little bit of conversation between him and his listeners. There's things happening in the village which are connected with listening to the stories. So he takes off from the actual storytelling and paints a kind of fuller canvas within which then he places the stories. So that is his device, his literary device to talk about his mother's life rather than his own.
Shantaji, I'm interested in knowing when did you actually decide to translate this book? From what I have known and read, there hasn't been a good translation of the book Shamchi Ai. What prompted you to take this? You have been doing a lot of work with in translation. So was this always at the back of your mind? You wanted to do this one too?
Yeah, I, uh, I had this private list of texts which I had to translate. Um, and one of them I did 3 years ago, Smriti Chitre, which is a huge tome, and I had to find a stretch of time for that. The other one, which I'm working on, is Brahman Kanya, which was also written in the 1930s. And it's a novel that means a lot to me personally. And it is a classic. In fact, I had started work on Brahman Kanya when Penguin asked me if I would translate Shamji. So then, of course, my wish to do it and their wish to have it done matched perfectly. So then I put aside Brahman Kanya and did this. I've gone back to it now. So it's been a long-standing thing. Um, Little by little, as and when I get time, I go to my private list. The rest of the time, I have done things that friends have wanted me to do for them. Basically, translating their plays. I was so much part of theater, and it was so important to get some of these extremely fine plays out there in English. Not necessarily to be performed, because very few people perform English texts on our stage, but it became a medium for people from other language cultures to read and then translate into their own language. Actually, Sane Guruji, I have to apologize to him because his great idea was Antar Bharati, that there should be translations between one Indian language and another. And only then will there be true integration of the country. Because through translation of texts, you come to understand the other culture. And this is extremely important. So, but then I'm saying to Sani Guruji, English is now an Indian language. This is all I can do. I wish I could translate from Marathi into Gujarati or Bengali, but I'm limited to this second language. Sorry.
things I noticed in the book, and it really stands out for me. And I think that is where the helplessness that I spoke about earlier comes from, is poverty. There is so much poverty, and you see, it is actually a gradual decline of a family. From having everything in their means, and you know a happy life mother was married into, and suddenly be pushed into something that she hadn't seen coming. And that also in a way leads to what happens in the end. I don't want to give it away to readers, but it really does take a toll, mentally, emotionally, on Sham's mother. uh, you did mention that you tried to tone down the poverty when translating the book. um, when you mean toned down, do you mean to say that it was really stark in the original work?
No, I haven't said I've toned down the poverty. You can't do that because that is actually the content of these stories is poverty. You can't fiddle around with that. What I have said I've toned down is the um, the tearfulness. The tears are constantly flowing in this book, and there are every language has its own uh, possibilities, its own limitations, and it comes with the culture of the people who speak that language. Now, tearfulness is extremely difficult to make mm, to make it sound not mushy in English. The minute you have sentiment followed by tears, there is a danger of people reading in English being slightly put off because it becomes very mushy. So, if, for instance, there is a sentence in which the author is saying, and then I cried, and then in that same sentence, I cried or Bhau cried. So you have this flood of tears, which doesn't necessarily make the situation more pathetic. The pathos is there in the situation itself. And one tearful reaction to it is enough. You don't need a second one. So it is in order to have the same effect of suffering on the English language reader, which this does on the Marathi. I mean, ultimately, we love weeping. We are extremely emotional people. So there's a lovely line in one of Mahesh L. Kunchwar's play where he is talking about the typical uh, mainstream play. And he says something like, there on the stage, someone is making pickles, and out in the audience, people are stuffing their mouths with their handkerchiefs and weeping away. So it's just a way of saying that tears come very easily, and tears are valued. That's also important. The fact that we are a sentimental people is something that we are proud of. And so, uh, uh, so many tears flowing is more than acceptable in Marathi, but in English, it sounds a little over the top. So it's only on occasions like that where as I said, I have toned down. That is, I haven't translated it in the excessive way in which it is present in the original.
Thank you so much, ma'am. There is this beautiful line in the book, somewhere in the middle, where when Sham is talking to his friends in the ashram, he says something to this effect: "When you truly understand something, you assimilate it and live by it." And that brings me to the last question of the day. Ma'am, having translated this book, what is that those values that you have assimilated in the process?
Not in the book, Jane, because these values are actually um, the values that all parents want to give their children. So I would say that reading the book back then made me feel yes, maybe Sham's family is poor. Maybe he doesn't get all the things that I get. But we are connected because my parents are telling me the same things that his mother told him: self respect, honesty, perfectionism, and above everything, love. There's a paucity of love today. I think we value anger much more. To be angry is to be strong. In my mind, to love is to be strong. And that's what I was taught. And that's what Chance I teaches him. So it's not that I got this from reading Shamchi Ai, but this is the thread, very strong thread, that connected me to the book.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Incredible speaking to you. Thank you for your wisdom, which shines through in the book and even outside. We will now open the floor to the audience. We will take a couple of questions. If uh, Yes, there is a question here, ma'am. Any other such book you would like to translate which is similar to the stature of this book?
Yeah, actually, I think the book that I mentioned, Brahman Kanya, in a different way, stands up to this. We were talking about how Sham's eye is confined within the context of her times. Brahman Kanya is actually breaking that mold. The protagonist in the book is doing things that don't fall into the respectable category. And she's doing that out of anger, anger for the situation in which she finds herself. I mean, I don't want to talk about the situation, only to say that it is another kind of um, reformism. Sane Guruji was a total reformist. In his book, you have that story, for instance, where his mother tells him to go and help the Mahar woman. And then she says, okay, if the other Brahmins yell at you, tell them your mother's going to give you a bath afterwards. Which means that personally, she doesn't believe in this kind of untouchability where you have to purify yourself if you touch. So she is there. She is herself a reformist. And so Sane Guruji became in his life. So it's not so far apart. But in Brahman Kanya, the woman protagonist actually breaks the mold and walks out. So it has that same sort of stature. Oh, I, I don't remember, Harshil. I had to struggle so hard. But I think what I have done is this is what a translator has to do when she is translating a concept rather than a word. She has to expand the idea of Sasurvas. I think I have cunningly woven into the line as I have translated it. It's impossible to find a word for it, it doesn't exist. There was some question from
Yes,
Himangi.
yes. I think Himangi said it was an absolutely enlightening talk.
Ah,
She didn't
oh,
have a
it's
question. Yes.
okay, okay.
So I think yes. Yeah, we don't have any more questions, ma'am. But thank you so much. Incredible. I hope everyone gets to picks up this book and reads it because this is something that we need, I think, today and forever. Um, it's like a little Bible that you can, and go back to, which is very personal because it's relatable. Anyone can read it, a child, and even an 85 or 90-year-old. Had a great conversation, ma'am. Thank you so much.
I enjoyed it too. Thank you.
Thank, thank
Thanks to everyone who's connected with organizing this.
Yes,
It was
Crossword
really,
and Penguin, it's been
yes,
delightful. Thank
yeah,
you again.
yes. Thank
Great.
you. Okay.
Okay. Bye.